Welcome to this Readapalooza Deep Dive featuring Stephanie Stollar.
Hello, everyone. I'm David Brobeck from Walsh University, and welcome to the Deep Dive from the Readapalooza. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Stephanie Stollar.
Hello, everyone. I'm Stephanie Stollar, and thank you, David, for organizing this opportunity. This is sort of a follow-up to the Readapalooza event where I presented a very brief introduction to the science of reading. Someone challenged me, actually, one afternoon to summarize some of the most important concepts related to the science of reading in a 3-minute or less presentation. So she said, sometimes we only get 3 minutes to speak at a board meeting. So how could we present all of these decades of research findings in a 3-minute presentation? So that's what appeared in the original Readapalooza event. And David asked me if I would provide a little bit deeper information. And so I'm going to be doing that today, and I invite your questions. This is really your time. So I want to address whatever brought you here, make sure that you get your needs met. And so use the chat feature to send in your questions. I believe you'll stay muted. You can unmute if I don't catch your question or you want to interrupt with a question. And the session will be recorded for viewing later also. So heads up if you unmute or show your video. Okay, so here are the points that were included in my original 3-minute presentation. And this is a summary, and then I'm going to just go a little bit deeper into some of these concepts. One of the most surprising findings for me, I guess, many years ago, probably 25 years ago, when I was early in my career as a school psychologist, was that reading isn't natural. It's not a developmental skill. It's not something that just happens or appears when we put students in the right kind of literacy-rich environment. We know a lot more about this now and about how to ensure that reading actually does happen for students. There is one way that reading occurs in students' brains. There's not necessarily only one way to teach students to read. There are some ways that have more evidence behind them than others, but there is just one pathway to reading, and we're starting to know a lot more about that pathway or sequence. And there's a lot that we can influence along that pathway. So what we do in the classroom very much is an important factor in whether or not a student becomes a reader, and that's very empowering. It is easier for some students to become readers than others, and the instruction that students receive can be a major variable in that. The kind of instruction that tends to work for most students is what would be described as explicit and systematic, very purposeful and intentional instruction. Again, not waiting to see if it develops naturally. In some students, it won't, and we want to be ahead of that, not wait for that to happen, because prevention is really key when it comes to early reading. We don't want to wait until a student has a reading problem. So I thought I'd include Dr. Louisa Moat's definition of the science of reading, because sometimes people get confused and think that this expression means a particular program or a particular approach, or that it's narrowly defined just around teaching phonics. And so I like this definition for dispelling some of those rumors or misunderstandings. Really what we're talking about is a compilation of lots and lots of research that has converged over many years that has implications for the way that children are taught in the classroom. For me personally, what has driven me in my career is information about how we can prevent reading problems from happening in the first place. I remember in the late 80s reading some of the work by Joe Torgeson and others about the possibility that he had actually implemented of getting almost every student to the end of first grade reading expectations. And so I've spent the rest of my career really communicating the power of prevention and encouraging others to understand how this can actually become a reality for students. So what you're looking at here is my crude PowerPoint hand drawing of, again, what we know from lots and lots of years of research with lots of different kinds of students in different kinds of schools, where we are exploring the connection between words correct per minute, oral reading fluency, and reading comprehension. This is one of the most central understandings related to reading that is counterintuitive, I think. But if you think about it, words correct per minute, what you're seeing along the left-hand side here, is an indicator of whether or not a student is understanding the text that they're reading. Students need to be so accurate and automatic with word level reading, the ability to effortlessly read connected text, that their brain can be freed up to focus on the meaning of what they're reading. That's what we're looking for. That's what's being measured when you do something like an oral reading fluency assessment. It's both indicating if a student is understanding what he or she is reading, and it's predicting reading performance in the future. So a very powerful 1-minute assessment. That's why it's been used for 30 years in so many different types of assessments for screening and progress monitoring. So what I'm showing here is what tends to happen over time when we follow students, when we measure groups of students on oral reading fluency, again, as an indication of comprehension. We tend to see this pattern over and over again, that students who have a minimal level of words correct per minute as they leave first grade tend to branch out into this group of sort of middle performing readers that you see represented in blue. And students who are struggling at the end of first grade tend to continue to struggle. They'll make a little bit of progress year to year, but they're typically not making the kind of life-altering progress that allows them to catch up to their middle performing peers. And in fact, the difference gets greater over time. And those of you working in the intermediate grades know exactly what that gap starts to look like. This is what Keith Stanovich coined as the Matthew effect. Not only are students having difficulty if they're having trouble with word level reading, words correct per minute, but that spirals into not wanting to spend time reading, not reading more complex text, which impacts students' ability to learn through reading, not just content knowledge, but gain additional comprehension skills, gain additional vocabulary. And so the gap gets bigger over time. What you might also notice in this picture is the two groups are hard to distinguish in kindergarten and in the beginning of first grade. And this is the real opportunity. If we know what this level of reading performance is at the end of first grade, where the groups are sort of divided, we can predict it with what we do and what we assess in kindergarten and early first grade. And so this is what has been summarized, for example, in the National Reading Panel report now 20 years ago, and so many studies since then about what it takes to get students onto that successful pathway by the end of first grade. So I want to spend a little time talking about what the skills are that students need to acquire, how you might best teach those skills, and how to organize your school system to make the prevention of reading failure a reality for the vast majority of your students. So this slide and the one after it, which are available in the handout that hopefully David will make available to all of you, these are some summary points of the things that I've been discussing, and a reference to Joe Torgeson's work summarizing, again, some of these ideas. So rather than trying to remediate a reading problem, we want to be focused on making sure that we are equipping students with the prerequisite skills, the foundational skills, to prevent them from having a reading problem in the first place, or to minimize what the impact of those reading disabilities might be down the road. I have had the opportunity to work with a lot of different schools and a lot of different districts all around the country. And I've seen patterns of data that play out over time. I've seen low performing districts turn around their outcomes, like the ones that you can see on this slide, where they're going from, let's say, 39% of their students on track at the beginning of kindergarten to 81% or 90% on track at the end of kindergarten. And this has really reinforced for me the power of prevention and also the impact of what you do in the classroom. So how a student enters school is not going to tell the whole story of how they exit school, how they are performing in first grade. What you do in the classroom matters. So I'm just organizing my thinking around these 4 points. Why teach? Why base your teaching in the science of reading, in the reading research? What to teach? So some organizing thoughts about the skills to focus on, how to teach those particular skills, and then the structures for implementation of a prevention-based school-wide literacy model, what you might think of or call multi-tiered systems of support, or MTSS. So just a very quick overview of, and this is my understanding, so those of you who are listening can check me on this, but how the circuits in your brain get rewired for you to become a reader. So when we're born, we don't necessarily have the neurobiological predisposition to read. Our brains are not naturally set up for reading. Speech is sort of the foundation of reading, and our brains are hardwired for speech. So reading, the application of the print component to that, so being able to deconstruct spoken language into individual phonemes that then get mapped onto letters, that is a more recent invention, the writing systems and reading. So our brains have to actually be recycled into a circuit that allows these visual systems and word knowledge systems and phonology systems to come together in a way that's unique for reading. And instruction in the classroom can either support this or not. And it's important that we're aware that this is not going to happen naturally. We shouldn't take a position of just wait and see. We shouldn't misunderstand and think reading is a developmental skill, and when the child is ready for reading, that it will happen. Those old beliefs have really been disproven by the more recent research and information that we've been able to gather through brain scans. So that information about what it takes in the brain can be captured in some skill areas, some large sets of skills, let's say, some skill domains that need to be acquired for students to become readers. And one of those involves the language structures. So vocabulary, oral language, syntax, the ability to pay attention to speech at the level of the individual phoneme. And the second large area of skills would be those connection to print skills, being able to map sound to print, being able to decode accurately and automatically. And it's the intersection of those two skill areas that supports students to understand what they're reading. So in the late 80s, 2 researchers put these ideas together into what we now call the simple view of reading. And basically this is helping us to simplify the very complex process of what it takes to become a reader into the concepts of decoding and language comprehension, and the interaction of those 2 skills leading us to reading comprehension. So I think about young children coming into kindergarten. We want to be building both skill areas, their oral language, their knowledge of the structures of spoken English, and also their word level or decoding skills. for older students who are struggling with reading comprehension, I think about these two broad skill areas as potential realms of remediation and support. So prevention and intervention, working at both directions. So the simple view of reading talks about the interaction of these two skill areas, that it's not an addition problem, it's a multiplication problem. If you have decoding skills, if you have grade level decoding skills, but you're lacking language comprehension, you're not going to understand what you read. And the opposite is true. If you have grade level language comprehension, if you can understand stories that are read to you, stories that are told to you, but you can't decode the print, you're also going to have a reading comprehension challenge. That it's really required to have both of these elements in place. So lots of implications there for instruction and assessment. The skill areas that were summarized in the National Reading Panel report, I'm just sort of putting them here so you can make the connection to those 5 foundational early literacy skills, how they line up within the simple view of reading, to see that we're still focusing instruction on those same skill areas. Here's the same information in a table. Language being the origin of reading, where students need to get to the point that they can manipulate the individual phonemes in spoken language and start to connect those phonemes to the graphemes, the letters or letter combinations that represent the English writing system, and that those skills are connected to what students are typically coming into school with, understanding of a variety of words. We want to build those foundational skills into the ability to read connected text accurately, fluently, and ultimately for meaning. So this gives you a way of organizing those 5 essential early literacy skills in a table describing very briefly each one of them. So the third concept is to explore what the research tells us about how to teach these essential skills. We know we want students to acquire them in kindergarten and first grade. End of first grade, words correct per minute is an important indicator of reading comprehension and predictor of future reading performance. We know we need to support those foundational skills, but how? So the research is really clear in a couple of areas that explicit instruction works best, particularly for students who we find out later are going to struggle learning to read. And it doesn't hurt anyone, even students who might learn to read in spite of us or in spite of any particular teaching method. Those students are not harmed by having explicit instruction. It's a matter of deciding when to teach explicitly in what context, and more on that in a second. So explicit instruction involves breaking complex tasks into smaller units and showing students explicitly with a model what you want them to do before you expect them to do it on their own. So this is not discovery learning. This is not taking the child's lead. This is having a very clear, very compartmentalized, task analyzed sequence of skills that you want students to perform and showing it to them directly, supporting them then to be able to accomplish those tasks on their own. And one of the elements of explicit instruction that I think is really important to keep in mind is setting students up to perform tasks correctly from the get-go, the first time. I think of it as errorless learning. This is what we want to support students to do when they're learning a new skill that's so high priority, like reading. So errorless learning, not letting them make mistakes when it comes to reading instruction. We also want to make sure that we're teaching reading in a way that's systematic, that takes students in a very planful sequence through instructional routines that minimize the teacher talk and engage students in working with the skills and allow them to review in a way that moves them from being accurate in the skill to being automatic in the skill. And then finally, we want to be teaching these foundational skills in a way that's sequential, going from easier to harder, giving students the skills, again, in those small units in a way that doesn't confuse them, in a way that's clear, and allows them to build on what they know. Again, moving from accuracy to automaticity. So I've created a table that allows you to see the skill areas, those foundational, essential skill areas, in a side-by-side comparison of what you might think of or hear folks talk about as structured literacy approaches aligned to the science of reading, and what would be described as more typical literacy practices, what you might see in classrooms where they're not implementing the science of reading. So I'll just highlight a couple of the features in each of the skill areas here, and you can follow up with questions or provide your input. Phonological awareness is one of the places where structured literacy and typical literacy practices diverge. I would say that this is really a keystone skill that if we want students to be readers by the end of first grade, we have to support them to make that speech to print connection. So instruction needs to be working not just at the level of spoken word families. Instruction needs to not just start with print. Instruction needs to start with spoken words, and not just the meaning of spoken words, but also being able to work with and manipulate sounds in spoken language all the way down to the individual phoneme. It's the phoneme that gets mapped to print. So in the area of phonics and spelling, the key difference here is going from speech to print instead of from print to speech. That is what differentiates these two different methods or approaches to instruction. And the instruction in phonics and spelling needs to be integrated. That's most helpful for students, and needs to take that purposeful approach. So let me give an example that would draw a contrast here. So typical literacy practices might have students working in small groups, might have them using some type of trade book or leveled or predictable text for their reading. And then the teacher might respond to mistakes that students are making as they're reading that book. Where structured literacy would start with the letter sound connection, would teach students specifically to blend letter sounds together, to read words in isolation, in phrases, in sentences, and practice to automaticity and controlled decodable text. So there's a little overlap here in some of the differences you'll see in the text reading section as well. When it comes to vocabulary and oral language development, I would say one main difference that I've observed is in the text that's used for reading aloud. We really want to be using the read aloud as the way to develop that language comprehension strand in the simple view of reading. We want to be reading aloud to students texts that are much more complex than what they could read on their own. So it's not a model of a book that they're going to be reading themselves in small group. It's a model of much more complex language than what the student could read on their own, in a variety of different genres, with lots of different types of syntax, and really extending the oral language of students through that read aloud. And then finally, in terms of reading comprehension, I would just draw out the contrast here. In typical literacy practices, I see a lot of strategy instruction, a lot more strategy instruction than what the research supports in terms of the amount of time that's spent on it. And strategy instruction that's starting too early is really common, too early than what the research would support. Students who can't yet read accurately and automatically in grade level text are being asked to perform those comprehension strategies through independent reading. And the research would really support spending more time on building general background knowledge, planfully building content knowledge as a way to support reading comprehension. So I said I would refer back to this idea of when to use explicit instruction. This idea comes from Anita Archer, whose book, Explicit Instruction, should be in your professional library if it isn't already. It's an excellent resource, as is her website by the same name. And she draws the distinction to put people at ease if they think they have to be teaching directly and explicitly all day, every day. She sets out this kind of not an either or approach, explicit or student-led or more of a constructivist approach, but to a when should we be using different approaches, student-led versus teacher-directed. So she would say in terms of student characteristics, if the student has a history of failure in the skill area, we need to be more directive and explicit. If the student has very little background knowledge in the subject area, we need to be more directive and explicit. And if the student has struggled, if the student is already a struggling reader, we need to be more supportive, more explicit. Also in terms of the range here, so this is what I'm pointing out with my graphic, is that if the student has a lot of knowledge, has a history of success, we can be less teacher directed, lower on the end of explicitness. But if a student is new to a skill, has struggled in the past with a skill, if there's one correct answer that can be easily and directly taught, we don't need students to discover it, then we should be high on the continuum of explicit and systematic. So hopefully that helps lay that out a little bit for you. So the fourth area that I think of when I sort of summarize the science of reading is what we know about delivering this kind of instruction on these essential skills. How best to make this a reality in school settings. And the MTSS, or multi-tiered systems of support model, is a way of operationalizing prevention of reading failure. It's actually from a public health model about 3 tiers of prevention. And so we're applying prevention concepts to reading instruction, where all students will reach that end of grade level expectation, but what it takes to get everyone there will vary in intensity. So that's why the percents add to 100. Everybody gets to the grade level expectations, but they don't all get there with the same amount or type of instruction. The way that this plays out in schools is through the use of universal screening data, so that you know how many students at each grade level are getting to your grade level expectations. And you can use that information first and foremost to differentiate what you're doing with all students in the first core reading instruction. This is your number one opportunity to change reading outcomes for your students. Intervention is important. It's essential for some students, but intervention is not going to be sufficient. Like those schools I showed you where they went from 30-some% on track at the beginning of the year to 90% on track at the end of the year. That doesn't happen through an intervention system. It happens by matching the instruction that all students are receiving in their regular education classroom, tier 1 instruction, to the needs of the students in that grade level and classroom. This is critically important. A highly differentiated, explicit and systematic core reading program that matches to student needs is the most powerful prevention tool. Some students who have been identified as being at risk are going to need something in addition to that tier 1 instruction to get to your grade level expectations. So tier 2 or strategic support would be available for that smaller number of students. It is an additional dose of instruction. They don't come out of their 90 to 120 minutes of core instruction to get their tier 2 intervention. It's an extra dose at another time of day. So tier 1 instruction is primary prevention of reading failure. Tier 2 is secondary prevention of reading failure. It is accelerating students' learning so that they catch up to the grade level expectations. It's going to take something even more individualized and intensive, perhaps, to get that last 5% of students to your grade level expectations. And that would be, again, in addition to the core reading instruction that all students are getting. What makes Tier 3 more intensive than Tier 2? In terms of the amount of time, in terms of group size, so you can increase the opportunities to respond, and in terms of that explicit I do it, we do it, you do it instructional cycle. Students in the group in Tier 3 all have the same next step for instruction, where in Tier 2, the groups might have a wider range of skill needs. Those are some ways to differentiate how we make it more intensive as you go up through the tiers. Part of one of the components of an MTSS model is having a school-wide assessment system. You actually need to have a system of assessments that answer 4 questions for you. You need to know which students and which systems are at risk. And to answer those questions, you need universal screening assessments. You also need to know, for those smaller number of students who are getting Tier 2 or Tier 3 supports, what specifically is the next step each student needs in the instructional hierarchy. And to answer those questions, you need a reading diagnostic assessment. To answer questions about growth for individual students, you need progress monitoring assessments. And to know if students met your end of grade level expectations, your standards at each grade level, you'll need outcome evaluation assessments. A system of MTSS will require you to answer all of these questions, and you'll need at least one assessment, just one is good, for each of these purposes to answer each of these questions. These assessments are used within a specific database decision-making model. This is what sits at the base of MTSS, so that you can ask and answer questions about your students. A lot of people are becoming interested and curious about this expression, the science of reading, these days, but they're jumping into particular practices that they hear about or watch online without matching it to the needs of their students. So I want to encourage you to make sure assessment is at the heart of your implementation of research-based practices and at the heart of your organization of those practices into a 3-tier model. Just because something is research-based doesn't mean that it's a match or a need for your system or for your particular students. And you can't know unless you've done some assessment. The problem-solving process gives you that structure for asking and answering questions. Okay, so that's my deeper dive into the 6 points that I summarized in the original Readapalooza 3-minute presentation. I have some ideas that I shared in that original presentation about where to learn more that I'll share with you here. Since David and I are in Ohio, and Ohio is doing amazing work out of the Department of Education, I would encourage you to explore their website. And on a national level, if you're not familiar with the Reading League, I encourage you to explore theirs as well. You can watch a variety of excellent webinars from Voyager Sopris Learning on many topics related to research-based reading instruction. Especially if you are a parent or community member, seek out support from your local branch of the International Dyslexia Association or Decoding Dyslexia chapter. I've listed a couple of documents here that I encourage you to look up and read. I think these are really good starting places to learn more about the science of reading. I encourage you to listen to the podcasts. I think she has 3 now, maybe 4, from Emily Hanford about the state of the art related to reading instruction in the United States. If you're looking for in-depth professional development, I highly recommend the Letters Professional Development Program by Louisa Moats. offered through Voyager Sopris Learning, or Deb Glazer's Reading Teachers Top 10 Tools. Both are excellent. They're not program specific. They are to support your knowledge as an educator. A couple of the videos on YouTube that serve as really good starting places are listed here. There are a variety of Facebook groups where I think really good information is being shared. And a few of the books, if you'd like to approach your learning that way, that I would suggest as starting places. You can certainly reach out to me. My contact information is here and on the last slide. So I'm coming at this from a perspective of a learner. I've been learning about reading, reading assessment, reading instruction and intervention for 30 years now. I don't plan on stopping. There's still a lot to learn. I certainly don't know it all. And so a couple of expressions or quotes that guide me in my work that might be helpful to you wherever you are. Start where you are. Forgive yourself for anything that may have happened in the past. Don't feel frustrated about what you don't know. Just start today with learning something new. So hopefully this has been helpful, and I'm going to check the chat box for questions or comments, things that folks would like to chat about.
The chat box has been very quiet.
We have a quiet group, huh?
But
Maybe that means I've answered all the questions that they came with. Or it means it's Friday afternoon and folks are tired. Either hypothesis could be operating.
So we can, if you want to unshare your screen,
I will do that.
you can see if folks would like to talk that way.
If anybody wants to
Move it to the
show their camera or unmute their mic.
nice, everybody.
So David shared that the handouts are going to be placed on the Some More site where you registered.
So they all have the invitation, and that's a nice place to put them off. So thank you, everybody, for being part of this recording. And I'm going to turn that off just in case somebody would like to talk to us without having to be recorded.